If I started talking about a story with a dragon, treasure, royalty, betrayal, and a very high body count, I could be talking about any number of popular books or TV shows. Game of Thrones might spring to mind. Then you might think of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, or Narnia, or Merlin, or fairy tales in general. Really, in being aimed firmly at adults, Game of Thrones is a bit of an outlier. These medieval-ish things are in many ways the classic ingredients of children's stories. So perhaps it's not surprising that Victorian and Edwardian writers decided that the Nibelungenlied, a 13th century German epic containing all these features, was the perfect material for a children's book. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a few of those authors. And I'm also going to have to beg your indulgence immediately, because these stories are a mixture of Victorian and Edwardian, but that's a bit clunky for a title, and the balance came down on the later side. I'm going to focus on the versions produced by Lydia Hans, whose Golden Threads from an Ancient Loom was published in 1880, Gertrude Schottenfels, whose Stories of the Nibelungen for Young People appeared in 1905, and Thomas Cartwright, who issued Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, a twice-told tale in 1907, because these are the fullest children's adaptations of the Nibelungenlied itself. But they're part of a bigger picture of what I'll call Nibelungenlied adjacent material. The people who adapted these stories for children didn't really distinguish between material they took from the German tradition, material they took from the related Norse tradition, material they took from Wagner, and material they just made up. And these three do that too, even as they depict themselves as adapters of the Nibelungenlied. So I now want to give you a bit more detail about each of our texts and, where possible, their authors. Lydia Hans has proven impossible to track down. It's possible that she's the Lydia Hans who was buried at St Leonard's Church in Hythe in 1884, in which case she was a governess and the daughter of a bookseller. But that has to remain speculation. She includes a preface in which she describes her work as an attempt to bring the main features of the Nibelungen lay before the notice of the younger portion of the British public. But she's also at pains to characterise it as generally faithful. She asks for the indulgence of critics for occasional departures from the strict letter of the text. Then, almost rewriting the matter again, she says that her object has simply been to collect some of the golden threads of beauty that lie scattered through the poem, and to braid them together in such a form as might be acceptable to the dear young friends for whom the story was written. She certainly feels that not all of the Nibelungenlied is appropriate for children, but her sense of a kind of ethno-nationalistic duty to make the narrative available trumps any scruples. A story so popular amongst our Teutonic cousins ought not to be altogether unfamiliar to the youth on this side of the German Ocean. Now we move to our next author, Gertrude Schottenfels, about whom we can be a bit more certain. The details are still relatively scarce. By profession, Schottenfels trained student English teachers at the State Normal School in Cheney, Washington. Stories of the Nibelungen for Young People was her first attempt to adapt a work for children. But by 1909, she'd also published children's versions of another 13th century German work, Wolfgang von Eschenbach's Parzifal, as well as of works by more modern authors, including the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Unlike Hans, she doesn't provide us with any kind of introductory statement to guide our interpretation. What we see in her adaptation is an overwhelming attempt to eliminate any kind of moral complexity. We're really in a fairy tale realm here of knights and princesses, good and evil. And finally, we have Thomas Cartwright. His Sigurd the Dragon Slayer was one of a series of 8 books put out by Heinemann under the title Every Child's Library. Several of these were based on medieval works. Sigurd's stablemates included adaptations of Beowulf and Reynard the Fox, as well as tales of the Norse gods. Now, Sigurd the Dragon Slayer had a subtitle, A Twice-Told Tale. This is meant very literally. Cartwright first gives the narrative according to material found in Norse sources. He then goes back to the beginning and starts again, giving the characters their German names. Sigurd becomes Siegfried, Gudrun becomes Kriemhild, and so on. Cartwright begins with an explanation. You have read the story of Sigurd, as told by the saga men of the Vikings, and I hope you agree with me that it is a fine old yarn, worthy of being kept alive for all time by the children of the North. This is certainly the feeling of our cousins, the Germans, in whose veins, as in ours, runs the blood of the Vikings. He goes on, I hope, when you have read this account of the Lay of the Nibelungs, that being the poem in which the noble life and sad ending of King Siegfried is related by the Germans, you will think with me that it has, on the whole, changed for the better. Cartwright, it's worth pointing out, helps it on its way here by including a few elements from the Norse material itself and from a much later German Siegfried narrative, presumably because these join up with the material he includes in the first half of the book. While I would stress that there's no reason to believe that any of our three adapters were able to read Middle High German, the literary language in which the Nibelungenlied was written down, there were countless modern German translations of the full text, as well as several full translations into modern English, and various detailed summaries. Lydia Hans used the first in the shape of a full translation into modern German by the ridiculously prolific German philologist Karl Zimrock. Thomas Cartwright used two from the last category, both of which were pretty out of date by 1907. The summaries and partial translations produced by Henry Weber in 1814 and Thomas Carlyle in 1831. He lifts extensive sections directly from both. Schattenfels is silent on her source. What I'm saying is that the Nibelungenlied wasn't an obscure piece of literature. It had been categorized as the German national epic, and as we've already seen, plenty of Anglophone writers were anxious to stake a claim to it as their own cultural inheritance. So let's go back to the Nibelungenlied. In common with the broader tradition to which it belongs, adapting the text for children presented certain problems, because it contains features we probably wouldn't classify as PG even today. A wedding night gone wrong, ending up with the groom strung up from the wall, while his sister and brother-in-law are getting along famously in a nearby room. A rape and a lot of fairly extreme violence, including the decapitation of a child, the burning of a hall with hundreds of men inside, and drinking blood from corpses. And that's really only the half of it. But as far as our Edwardian authors were concerned, the sex, including the consensual sex, was a lot more problematic than the violence. And the real problem with the violence, at least from the perspective of these writers, was that a lot of it was instigated or perpetrated by a woman, the Queen Kriemhild. So they adapted the narrative so that it would be, as Lydia Hans had it, acceptable to the dear young friends for whom the story was written. This process is part of a phenomenon called medievalism, how people have responded to, adapted, used, and recreated the Middle Ages in scholarly, creative, political, and other contexts. And it tells us more about later societies and how they thought about themselves and their pasts than it tells us about the medieval period. So let's take a look at what actually happens in the medieval Nibelungenlied. In the first part of the narrative, we've got a brave prince called Siegfried, who, after killing a dragon and acquiring various superpowers, marries a beautiful young princess named Kriemhild. However, after 10 years of living happily ever after, Siegfried is murdered by Kriemhild's relative Hagen, with connivance from her brother Gunther, an unimaginable betrayal. His body is then left outside her door. For good measure, Hagen also has Kriemhild's treasure, a gift from her dead husband, stolen and sunk in the Rhine. This, on the whole fairy tale like part 1, is easily adapted for children, with one particular exception. And here's where I need to go into a little bit more detail about sexual violence in the Nibelungenlied. With Siegfried's help, Gunther has deceived Brunhild, a powerful warrior queen, into marrying him. Part of the deception involved Siegfried using an invisibility cape to give Gunther the appearance of possessing greater physical power than his bride. It also involves Siegfried portraying himself as Gunther's vassal. On their wedding night, Brunhild demands to know why Gunther has allowed his sister to marry a vassal. When he refuses to give her an explanation and attempts to consummate the marriage by force, tearing her dress, she overpowers him, ties him up, and hangs him from a nail on the wall so that she can sleep. The following night, an embarrassed Gunther enlists Siegfried's help again. Siegfried, wearing the invisibility cape, overpowers Brunhild so that Gunther can force himself on her. The loss of her virginity also entails the loss of her physical strength. Thereafter, Brunhild's status is entirely dependent on her husband's. Evidently, none of this was suitable material for a children's book. Schottenfeld's solution was simply to ignore all references to sex and to provide no explanation whatsoever for Brunhild's loss of power. Hans followed broadly the same strategy, though in rather an ingenious way. On the wedding night, so she has Gunther explain, Brunhild had taunted and mocked him beyond all endurance, and then forced him into a wrestling match with her, in which she proved herself to be the most athletic and untamable of women. She also conveniently locates Brunhild's strength in her ring and girdle, meaning that, if despoiled of these, she would become weak as any other woman, and Siegfried at once engaged to win them from her. The scene is thus set for Siegfried's intervention, not as an accessory to rape, but to assist his brother-in-law, who has found himself married to a wife who exhibits unfeminine tendencies. Lest there still be any question marks over Siegfried's behaviour, Hans writes, had not his own feeling of knight-errantry, which forbade him use any unnecessary harshness to a woman, restrained him, Brunhild would have been bound hand and foot, and hung up on the same lofty but ignominious height to which she had before condemned her lord and husband. Tying up any loose ends, she adds that Gunther, by agreement, had resigned all claim to Brunhild's ring and girdle, and that Brunhild's temper was now that of a mere woman, and woman-like. Imagining herself overcome by Gunther, she henceforth felt a very wife-like respect for her conqueror. So Hans has taken a scene of sexual violence and rewritten it so that 1, there is no sex, or any suggestion of it, except perhaps for adults reading between the lines. 2, there's no stain on the chivalry of the male protagonists. And 3, her audience is shown the consequences of transgressing acceptable standards of female behaviour. She'll come back to this point later on. In some ways, Cartwright comes the closest to the events in the Nibelungenlied, though he does, naturally enough, use plenty of euphemism. The wayward Brunhild, he tells us, will not do her duty as a wife, and she treats Gunther as though he were a stranger and not her wedded husband at all. Siegfried's role is described as undertaking to bring Brunhild to her duty, and so indeed, aided by the cloak of darkness and his 12 men's strength, he does. Brunhild's loss of strength is covered by the explanation that from this hour Brunhild became a loving wife to Gunther, all her magic powers have left her. It's not entirely dissimilar to Hans, really, except that Cartwright's strategy is to gloss over things rather than inventing details about wrestling matches. And like Hans, this heavy emphasis on Brunhild not being as a woman ought to be. While there's that, of course, in the medieval text, it's not such a singular focus as it is in either of these adaptations. Now, I'm not telling you about these changes to suggest that it's somehow exclusively Victorian or Edwardian to leave sex and sexual violence out of children's literature. Of course it's not. But what I want to do is to highlight some of the difficulties of adapting medieval or other works intended for adults, for children, and so that I can draw a contrast with how the more generalized violence is treated in these works. So let's move on to the second half of the Nibelungenlied. When I left off, Siegfried had just been murdered by Hagen, who was in cahoots with Gunther. Part 2 covers Kriemhild's decades-long search for revenge, her remarriage to King Etzel of the Huns, and the narrative's exceptionally bloody climax. I'll give you a bit more detail on that now. We begin at the point when Kriemhild has contrived to get Gunther, Hagen, and their enormous retinue to come and visit her. It's at this point in the medieval text that everything kicks off. Kriemhild goes for a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, she bribes someone to go and start a fight, which results in the deaths of 9,000 squires. She also, to the explicit horror of the medieval narrator, parades her young son at a feast as bait, knowing that his presence will rile Hagen. It does. As soon as Hagen hears about the deaths of all the squires, he cuts the boy's head off. After this, all hell breaks loose. There is an enormous fight, culminating in Etzel's men besieging Gunther's, who are trapped inside the hall. With no water and suffering from thirst, they begin to drink the blood of those who have been killed, while making disturbing comments about it being rather tasty. Kriemhild orders the hall to be burned down with everyone inside it. More fighting follows until Hagen and Gunther are taken prisoner and brought before Kriemhild by Dietrich, an exiled knight who has previously taken refuge with the Huns. Hagen refuses to reveal the location of Kriemhild's stolen treasure, while one of his lords remains alive. Predictably, Kriemhild responds by having her brother decapitated and brings his severed head to Hagen. She then cuts Hagen's head off herself using Siegfried's sword. An elderly bystander, outraged that a brave knight, even one who is his enemy, has been killed by a woman, kills Kriemhild himself. And the poem ends with a handful of shell-shocked survivors. With Hans, Schattenfels, and Cartwright, we see some different attempts to child-proof the story. Instead of taking things chronologically and starting with Hans, I'm going to do this according to degrees of whitewashing, so I'll start with Schattenfels. In her version, when the violence begins, Kriemhild has nothing to do with it. With no previous indication that anyone has planned anything, the Huns had fallen upon Gunther's men and slain them all. Basically, it's not Kriemhild's fault. Everything else is skated over or skipped until we reach the end of the text. When Hagen refuses to reveal the location of the treasure hoard, Schattenfels has Kriemhild say that she said she would spare Gunther's life if Hagen would tell her where the gold was secreted. But Hagen would not tell his secret, even to save the life of his liege lord and kinsman, and so she ordered that both of them should be beheaded, according to the custom of these olden times. And thus at last was Siegfried's death avenged by the once gentle and beautiful queen. This is a huge change. Even though we get an indication that Kriemhild is no longer gentle and beautiful, this ending fundamentally alters her depiction and her ultimate fate. She doesn't commit any act of violence herself, instead ordering someone else to execute Hagen along with her brother. This is presumably Dietrich, who'd willingly delivered the two men to Kriemhild, the sole proviso that he be the one to execute them. He sought Kriemhild and made her give her word of honour that he, and he alone, should be permitted to put them to death. After that, he turned the prisoners over into her keeping. Kriemhild presumably keeps her side of the bargain, as Schattenfels doesn't mention her breaking her word of honour, and she gets to remain alive. To explore the implications of this, we need to go back to the medieval text again. There, Kriemhild isn't perceived neutrally after all the deaths she's caused, but the male characters do cooperate with her, even to the point of bringing her Gunther and Hagen as prisoners. It's in taking up a sword herself that she really crosses a line, and that's as true for a 19th or early 20th century audience as it is for a medieval one. But there's an extra layer here in our adaptations. We're talking about stories for children. I described the first half of the Nibelungenlied as fairy tale-like, and Schattenfels really leads into that. She even starts stories of the Nibelungen for young people with the words, "in the good old days of long ago." Now, part of the point of fairy tales is that they're instruments of moral instruction, and that becomes a bit of a challenge if your princess protagonist has gone all Daenerys Targaryen, burned everything down and killed everyone. Schattenfels doesn't want to present Kriemhild as the villain. Our sympathies are to remain with her. So she rewrites her actions to be compatible with societal norms. Kriemhild doesn't engage in direct violence. She keeps her word of honour to a knight. She can thus, near enough, belong to the same category of princess as the protagonists of the fairy tales judged appropriate for children. And let's not forget, those can be pretty gory. It's all about who's actually carrying out the bloodshed. Active female violence is the preserve of stepmothers and wicked fairies, but even Snow White tacitly endorses her tormentor's fate, condemned by the prince to dance in red-hot shoes. Kriemhild is perhaps one step closer to the violence, having given the order for the beheading, but she's still held at a distance. Maybe she's desired vengeance on Hagen for years, but killing him isn't actually her idea. It's Dietrich who is the first character to suggest that Gunther should be killed, and as the sole person with authority to put either man to death, it's Dietrich who gets the final say, even after Kriemhild has given her order. Yes, she's not beautiful and gentle anymore, but since she's kept her promise and both circumstances and public opinion are in her favour, she can't really be in the wrong. She simply acted according to the custom of these olden times, even if it comes with the implied caveat that her behaviour wouldn't be acceptable in the modern world. Let's look at Lydia Hans now, who has a different strategy. We don't see the same attempt to obscure the violence or to depict Kriemhild as essentially uninvolved. In fact, because Hans uses a very famous series of woodcuts to illustrate the addition, some of the violence is extremely in your face. But what she does do is to try and explain away some of Kriemhild's culpability by depicting her as insane with grief at the loss of her child. So, in Golden Threads from an Ancient Loom, Kriemhild initially has a rather non-specific desire for revenge. She's not prepared to take action to make it happen. At one point, she's urged to action by 400 Hunnish knights, and she tells them that they can decide if Hagen deserves to die. Things change only after the slaughter begins. At this point, Kriemhild is in another room, entirely unaware of events. On hearing about the violence outside, Hagen rushes at Kriemhild and Etzel's son and decapitates him, so that, as in the medieval text, the child's head lands in his mother's lap. This is the turning point for Kriemhild. Then was there such a mighty wail of anguish and terror resounding through the palace that it must have pierced the very courts of heaven. As you might notice, this is completely different from the medieval text in which Kriemhild has willingly used her son as bait. But Hans Kriemhild plays no part in his death, and it turns her from a passive figure into a violent madwoman. After recovering from a fainting fit, she rushed wildly into the hall where they were holding parley. Her golden hair hung dishevelled on her shoulders, and a fire as of madness glittered in her. And then a frenzy as of madness possessed Kriemhild. Her enemy should not escape, even though her own life should be the penalty. And it's at this point she orders the hall to be burned with the men inside. So it's the death of her son that triggers Kriemhild's madness, and it's her madness which triggers her indiscriminate violence. Her violent outbursts are pretty much always preceded with reference to mental instability. When it comes to the climax, we read that she caused her servants to go at once to Gunther's prison chamber and cut off his head. Then, seizing it by the long hair which betokened his royal lineage, she re-entered Hagen's dungeon. Her eye glittering with the light of madness, and holding the ghastly thing before him, she bade him at once reveal where the Nibelungen hoard lay hid. Her fate had now absolved him from his oath. Just take a look at the illustration that accompanies this scene. What I want to show you here is that Hans does not attempt to remove Kriemhild from these actions or to downplay them. She actually emphasizes the violence and its consequences. And she's absolutely not alone in this. Anthony Kearney explains, Victorian writing for children is often marked by an odd mixture of the prudish, the high-minded, and the horrific. Many writers who flinched from the remotest sexual allusion were happy to regale their readers with scenes of torture, violent death, and general mayhem, all set out in gory detail. All this is true, but it presents a bit of a problem for Hans because until the last sections of Golden Threads, Kriemhild has been a likeable figure. A devoted wife and mother shouldn't be the person ordering the torture, violent death, and general mayhem. But the explanation that she's been driven mad by the murder of her son allows Hans to rationalise the violence, anchoring it in maternal loss. Samantha Pegg explains that female insanity was understood as a mechanism to preserve the idea of the female as moral guardian. Pegg is talking about madness in the legal system. So what Hans is doing is taking a well-established excuse for female violence and applying it to literature. Invoking madness reduces Kriemhild's agency and thus her guilt, while the madness itself is triggered by an external attack on the ultimate role of moral guardianship, motherhood. Hans has managed to keep most of the violence, including the hall burning and blood drinking, but she tweaks the circumstances to make it allowable within the context of children's literature. Let's look finally at Thomas Cartwright. Like Hans, he includes various violent images, though unlike Hans, he wasn't drawing on an established series of Nibelungenlied illustrations, but seemingly including images specifically made for his publication. So in some ways, it's a much more deliberate decision to put violence before the eyes of his young audience. He also includes most of Kriemhild's attempts to start the violence, but shies away from her using her son as bait. Hagen's killing of the child, though, isn't characterized as the impetus behind her embrace of violence. She's already well on that path by this point. What's interesting is that Cartwright isn't trying to maintain Kriemhild as a sympathetic protagonist, and he still can't bring himself to make her culpable in the death of her child. But, again, there are limits to what can be portrayed in a children's book. As we saw with Hans, those limits aren't always about the degree of violence, but Cartwright does shy away from some particularly gruesome images. The child's head doesn't land in his mother's lap, and there's no blood drinking. Quite a bit of the final section, as narrated by Cartwright, is taken directly from Henry Weber's 1814 partial translation of the Nibelungenlied. And it's in verse. Verse is always a sign that he's copying either Weber or Carlyle. And here we get another sense of what kind of violence Cartwright is comfortable with. Weber, in italics, plays up the horror of the scene. This is actually fairly common from male adapters of the Nibelungenlied, and this desire to make an example of Kriemhild for her actions by emphasizing their severity is the flip side of responses like that of Lydia Hans, which try to play down female culpability for violence. Cartwright removes Weber's verses, rewriting them to remove references to blood. He leaves one in. But he's even more reluctant to depict violence against a woman, even one who's behaved like Kriemhild. And he cuts off Weber before the verse describing Kriemhild's death, which includes lines like, "Among them Lady Kriemhild cut in pieces lay." Instead, he jumps straight to a conclusion. And so, by the death of Kriemhild at the hand of old Hildebrand, all ends in bitter woe. Then he switches to Thomas Carlyle's translation of the very last verse, summarising the state of general misery. It would be remiss of me, though, not to point out that the squeamishness does not extend to the images, and we do get an action shot of Kriemhild's death, which you can see on the slide. So that's all I've got time to tell you about these three 19th and early 20th century authors and the different decisions they made when deciding how to adapt an extremely violent medieval German epic for Anglophone children. I can't really sum it up better than Anthony Kearney did, but these adaptations really encapsulate the tendency to flinch from any hint of sex, while often, if not always, going all in on violence. And on that score, perhaps the surprise to the 21st century reader is what they choose to leave in.